identities or what masculinities are acceptable to be used. Now, masculinity is defined by a set of performed behaviors that have been historically associated with men. And therefore, the idea of a traditional individual must be defined as an accepted or acceptable behaviors performed by men. Now, how one feels about the current state of masculinity depends on your current station in life. If acceptable forms of masculinity has or is benefiting you, then I would imagine that you want everything to maintain the way that it's always been. You're advocating for the status quo. Because truthfully, you enjoy masculinity being only associated with men. And asking masculinity to evolve feels like a punishment. Now, on the other hand, if you're someone who has been brutalized, oppressed, and dominated by acceptable forms of masculinity, then asking the idea of masculinity to evolve is a part of your survival. Now, let's be clear. Masculinity is not inherently bad. It's not inherently problematic. But the performance of masculinity and its need to be oppressive, controlling, and violent to others is not an acceptable form of masculinity. Now, let's have a little fun for a second. If you were to pull out your phones right now and you were to Google the term masculinity, you would find some synonyms, and they would look like the term muscled, vigor, vitality, strength, and maleness. Now do the same for the term of femininity, and you will see some synonyms that say womanliness, womanhood, or womanly qualities. Now we can guess who was in the room to create these terms, but we definitely know who was not in the room to create these terms. And one of the problems with this accepted form of masculinity is that it's been historically set up in opposition to women. Now, on the surface, that may feel common, and that's part of the problem. Masculinity cannot be set up in opposition to femininity, and more specifically, women, because we don't have a world where women and men feel psychologically and physically safe, and all genders aren't allowed to express the full range of human emotions. Now, do we really want men to be rigid, to be fixed, to be static? I would imagine that the opposition doesn't want that either. Therefore, masculinity must expand. It must flex, right? Now, what is the crown jewel of masculinity? It's muscles, right? And when we think about muscles, how do we actually grow our muscles? Our muscles must continue to expand. They must flex. They must be dynamic. Otherwise, they will atrophy. So masculinity must learn something from its muscled kin and also flex. It must not atrophy in order to remain relevant. So therefore, we have to make sure that masculinity is always dynamic. In the movie On the Basis of Sex, which is a story about the life of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, there's a line that says, and I quote, "A court ought not to be affected by the weather of the day, but will be by the climate of the era. Masculinity must attend to the climate of this era. And this era is a Me Too era." Thank you, my dear friend, Tarana Burke. Therefore, masculinity can no longer center the needs of men, because the real critique of the Me Too movement is that men no longer get to say what's appropriate or inappropriate when engaging a woman. And asking men to be accountable for their actions is not a punishment. As our friend Ms. Simmons says, accountability is a radical form of love, not a punishment. The accepted form of accountability that we are currently experiencing is experiencing an arrested development, which we can no longer allow because it's killing not just women, but it's also killing men too. Men have the 4 times higher suicide rate. Men are less likely to go to the doctor. Men are less likely to seek out mental health services. And you white men, in America specifically, are 7 out of 10 of all suicides in America are middle-aged white men. So your attraction to power is actually fleeting. So you should probably do something a little bit different. So do we really want masculinity to stay the same? Now, these accepted forms of masculinity can be considered a Western invention, but they're not. They're an invention of really insecure men, right? Men who believe that without power, that they have no value. One might even say that these accepted forms of masculinity were created by men who were trying to figure out their place in the world. Because how does a man know his place in the world unless he's putting a woman in her place? But this accepted form of masculinity highlights something that's so sinister, something that's so mundane that it often goes unrecognized. That an entire class of people, as Audre Lorde has asked us, have never defined yourself for yourself. And if you do not define yourself for yourself, you will be crushed in the imaginations of others. Once we learn how to define masculinity individually and not through the eyes of others, we learn how to love ourselves. And we no longer need masculinity to be focused on ownership and control. And we learn that we cannot be emasculated. You can only emasculate yourself when you dehumanize another. In order for masculinity to evolve, we must start to reward young boys for being vulnerable and reduce our societal norms focus on being strong. We have to create new norms that allow the idea of masculinity to focus on honesty, accountability, transparency, and genuine feelings and emotions. And masculinity must be gender neutral. In order to create these new norms, we must create spaces for all adults and all genders to perform this type of masculinity free of shame and free of the idea that you will be shamed for showing up differently. These new behaviors that we build will form intimate relationships because in intimacy, we learn humility. And through the idea of humility, we learn that other people suffer. And when we can start to love ourselves more, we can focus our attention on caring for the other across boundaries of difference. Now, I want to close by a quote by a man named Shepard Bliss, who created the term toxic masculinity. And he says, there are many forms of masculinities. Masculinity is not singular or monolithic. Masculinity varies from man to man, from family to family, from culture to culture, and I added from woman to woman and amongst folks who are gender variant. Masculinity is learned. It's a learned behavior, and as such can be changed. It is made, it is not born. We become rather than we are. Masculinities emerge. They are processes rather than events, dynamic rather than static. I do believe that the archetypes influence our behavior, but I believe in a social construction of reality that's not an either or, but is a both and. Thank you.